Boom. A thunderclap exploded across the clear, cloudless sky of Beijing. It was a freak occurrence, a dry bolt from the blue that shook the very foundations of the city. Inside the Hall of Imperial Supremacy, the impossible happened. A body inside the royal coffin jerked upright. I opened my eyes and blinked, my head spinning. I looked around, completely dazed. Where was I? Why was I sitting in a coffin? The room looked like a massive, ancient palace. Near the entrance, a few guards were huddled together, whispering and pointing at the strange weather outside. "Hey," I shouted, my voice rasping. "You guys, where am I?" The guards froze. They turned around slowly, their faces pale. When they saw me sitting up in the casket, their eyes nearly popped out of their heads. One of them collapsed, his legs turning to jelly. "Ghost," he screamed. "The emperor has risen from the grave. Help! Someone get the monks from Manhwa Temple." I stared at them, confused. Their reactions were extreme. This didn't look like a movie set or a prank. I climbed out of the coffin and noticed my clothes had changed. I wasn't wearing my usual work gear anymore. Instead, I was draped in heavy, flowing robes of imperial yellow. I jumped down, marched over to the door, and grabbed one of the guards by his collar. "I asked you a question," I growled. "Where am I?" The guard was shaking so hard, he looked like he might wet himself. Your Majesty," he stammered. "This is the Hall of Imperial Supremacy." "Your Majesty?" I looked at their uniforms. They were unmistakably from the Ming Dynasty. A wild thought hit me. Had I traveled through time? "What year is it?" I demanded. The guard didn't dare hesitate. "It is the 7th year of the Tianqi era. August 24th. August 24th, Tianqi year 7. The date clicked in my mind. I remembered reading this in a history book because I shared a name with the emperor of that time, Zhu Yuxiao. According to history, the Tianqi emperor died today. His brother, Zhu Yujian, was supposed to take the throne immediately after. "Has the Prince of Xian taken the throne yet?" I asked. "Your Majesty, the Prince of Xian should be at the Hall of Central Peace right now," the guard replied, stumbling over his words. "He is receiving the officials for the succession ceremony." It was true. I had somehow taken over the body of the dead Emperor Zhu Yuxiao. I had come back to life. I thought about what happened next in history. If Zhu Yujian, the future Chongzhen emperor, took over, the Ming dynasty was doomed. He was paranoid, stubborn, and indecisive. He would lead the empire straight to the executioner's block, ushering in centuries of darkness. I couldn't let that happen. "Where is Wei Zhongxian?" I asked. "The eunuch Wei is also at the Hall of Central Peace, sire." "Lead the way," I commanded. At the Hall of Central Peace, the ceremony was reaching its climax. Zhu Yujian stood on the imperial path, holding the succession edict. He looked relieved, like a massive weight was finally lifting off his shoulders. He began reading the long, tedious scroll to the assembled officials. He reached the final sentence. "On this 24th day of August, I announce to heaven and earth that the new emperor shall..." Wait a minute. My voice cut through the hall like a knife. Every official froze and turned toward the entrance. A familiar figure stood there, framed by the light. Zhu Yujian's face turned a spectacular shade of pale. He had been living in terror since his brother's death, afraid of being assassinated before he could even be crowned. He hadn't even dared to drink the palace water. Now, just as he was about to finish the ceremony, his dead brother was standing in the doorway. I coughed twice and waved at him. "Brother, don't be in such a hurry to take the seat. Let me finish coming back to life first." The room went silent. Everyone was stunned. Then, one man broke the silence. "Wei Zhongxian." He shoved several officials aside and came crawling toward me, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. "Old master," he wailed, throwing himself at my feet. "Is it really you? You've returned. I deserve to die for not staying by your side." He started slapping himself across the face so hard his cheeks puffed up like a teenager's. I didn't need to ask who he was. In this entire empire, Wei Zhongxian was probably the only person who genuinely wanted me alive. As long as I lived, he stayed powerful. If I died, he was finished. "Get up and speak," I said, pulling him to his feet. Then I looked at my brother and smiled. "Well, Emperor, how have you been?" Zhu Yujian looked like he was having a heart attack. He had wanted this throne since he was a child. He once told me as a kid that he wanted to sit in the big chair. Back then, I told him to wait a few years and I'd give it to him. I guess I was right, but I wasn't ready to give it up just yet. The hall descended into chaos. Officials were screaming and scrambling over each other to get away from the ghost. One old man actually fainted on the spot. Only a few generals stayed put, though their shaking hands gave away their fear. I ignored the cowards and walked toward the throne. Wei Zhongxian was like a transformed man. He marched ahead of me, slapping any official who was in my path out of the way. He had been terrified of being purged by the new emperor, but now that his protector was back, he was back to his old, arrogant self. I didn't mind. I needed someone like him to keep these bureaucrats in line. I reached the top of the steps and stood next to Zhu Yujian. He was still staring at me, paralyzed. "Brother," I said, pointing at the dragon throne. "Do you want to sit there for a little longer?" Zhu Yujian snapped out of it. He looked at me, searching my face. "Brother, are you really alive?" He reached out to touch my face, but pulled back at the last second. He was a suspicious man by nature. I could see the gears turning in his head. Was I really dead? Or was this a test? Was I testing his loyalty to see if he secretly craved the throne? He knew I had no surviving sons. In his mind, this was a trap. The more Zhu Yujian thought about it, the more convinced he became. I was testing him. He thought I was a master actor with a cruel heart, playing a game to see if he truly craved the throne. He was frustrated, but when he caught sight of Wei Zhongxian standing behind me, he folded. Wei Zhongxian controlled more than half the officials in this hall. My brother had no foundation in the court. He knew he was powerless. Thud. Zhu Yujian dropped to his knees, looking up at me with pure terror. "Brother, please, calm your anger. I never should have coveted the throne. I shouldn't have listened to the officials' advice to hold this ceremony. I'm willing to step down and live as a commoner. I'll donate everything I own to the national treasury. Just, please, spare my life." I looked at him and laughed. I laughed hard. History hadn't lied. This guy really was a paranoid overthinker. "Brother, I was just joking with you," I said, my voice casual. "You were only following my funeral edict. What crime is there in that?" I sat down on the dragon throne, my legs spread slightly, my hands resting on the carved golden dragons. I gave Wei Zhongxian a sharp look. Wei Zhongxian was a sharp old fox. He had spent his whole life reading people's faces. The moment our eyes met, he understood. He threw himself onto the floor, prostrating himself with a loud cry. "This old servant greets the emperor. Long live the emperor. Long live, the eternal emperor." The officials who belonged to his faction snapped out of their daze. They didn't care if I was a ghost or a miracle. As long as I was the Tianqi emperor, Wei Zhongxian was safe. And if Wei Zhongxian was safe, their good lives would continue. Led by Tian Urging, the commander of the Imperial Guard, they all bowed in unison. Their voices shook the hall. "We greet the emperor. Long live the emperor." The rest of the officials, no matter how confused or suspicious, had no choice but to join in. The mountain of voices echoed against the high ceilings. "Rise," I said with a wave of my hand. I pointed to the official who had fainted earlier. "Someone take him to the Imperial Academy of Medicine. Get him treated." 4 guards rushed in and carried the old man out. I looked at the sea of confused faces before me and smiled again. "I know you're all wondering what happened," I said. "The truth is, I didn't actually die. I was summoned by the Hongwu Emperor. He took me away to give me personal instructions on how to rule." The hall went silent. Shocked whispers broke out. The Hongwu Emperor? That was Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder of the Ming dynasty. To be called away by the great ancestor himself was the ultimate divine blessing. It was a much easier story for them to swallow than, "I just woke up in a coffin." Before anyone could question it, Wei Zhongxian was back on his knees, his forehead hitting the floor. The emperor is wise. To be favored by the Hongwu emperor is a blessing for the Ming, a blessing for the world, and a blessing for every citizen. His cronies chimed in immediately. The rest of the court followed suit. It was a boring, predictable display. "Enough," I said, standing up. "Today's business is over. The great ancestor taught me many things, and I need to go write them down before I forget. You are all dismissed." Wei Zhongxian hurried forward, offering his arm to support me. As I leaned on him, a sharp, pungent smell hit my nose. Even with the dozens of scented sachets hanging from his belt, he couldn't hide the smell of stale urine. I winced inwardly but kept my face neutral as he led me out of the hall toward the palace of heavenly purity. As we walked, palace maids and eunuchs froze in their tracks. When they recognized me, their eyes nearly popped out of their heads. Under the stern gaze of the head eunuchs, they quickly lowered their heads and stood by the side of the path, stammering their greetings. I didn't look at them. I walked fast. My hands were clenched into fists inside my long sleeves, palms slick with sweat. I was a soul from the modern world trapped in an emperor's body. I was terrified someone would see through me. That was the real reason I wanted to leave the hall so quickly. The Palace of Heavenly Purity was massive. Its architecture was designed around the 9-5 principle, signifying the supreme status of the emperor. Inside, the throne sat under a grand plaque that read, "The Sovereign's Radiance." I walked to the jade desk. It was empty, no mountains of scrolls, just a few writing brushes. I picked one up, looked at it, and tossed it back. I knew how to use a brush, but only for basic things. Asking me to write formal documents in complex traditional characters in broad daylight was a recipe for disaster. I sat in the chair and looked at Wei Zhongxian. "Prepare the ink. I'll speak, you write." "As you command, master," Wei Zhongxian bowed. He signaled to a young eunuch to start grinding the ink stick. Once the brush was ready, I began to speak slowly. "Li Hongji, from Miji, Shangxi. Li Jin, from Miji, Shangxi. Lu Zhongmin, from Lantian, Shangxi. Li Dinghua, from Yulin, Shangxi. Zhang Xianzhong, from Dingbian, Shangxi. Gao Xiang, from Ansai, Shangxi." I paused. "Send people to Shangxi immediately. Find these men and bring them to me. I have great use for them." Wei Zhongxian stared at the paper, looking lost. These were names of nobodies. "Your Majesty, who are these people? Why would you?" My expression turned cold. "Among these men are soldiers, peasants, and bandits. As for why I want them, that is none of your concern." Wei Zhongxian's face froze. He immediately slapped himself hard across the cheek. He forced a fawning smile and bowed low. "This old servant has a big mouth. Please, your Majesty, forgive me." When I didn't respond, he kept slapping himself. Asterisk smack. 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 Asterisk. He didn't stop until a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. I waved him away impatiently. "Just manage your business in the Eastern Depot. Don't ask about anything else. Now, get out and do your job." Once he was gone, I beckoned to a guard standing nearby. "Go. Bring the commander of the Imperial Guard to me." A short while later, Tian Urging entered, dressed in his formal flying fish robe. He knelt quickly. "Your servant Tian Urging greets the Emperor." "Rise," I said. "I have a task for you." Tian Urging stood up, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He had passed Wei Zhongxian on the way in and seen the old man's face swollen like a pig's head. He was clearly terrified. I rubbed my temples, looking out at the shimmering heat waves in the courtyard. I want to know the personal wealth and assets of every single official in this court. If the Imperial Guard already has the records, get them ready. If you don't have them, go and investigate them immediately. I commanded, my voice cold and unwavering. From the highest princes in their palaces to the lowliest clerks in the dirt. Don't miss a single soul. But remember, keep this quiet. Not a word to anyone. Tian Urging's eyes lit up with sudden excitement. He wasn't a fool. He knew exactly what I was planning. What did the great Ming dynasty lack most right now? Money and grain. In a crisis like this, looking into the private bank accounts of every official wasn't an act of kindness. I wasn't planning on giving them a holiday bonus. I was looking for a reason to raid their homes and seize their assets. And who better to handle the dirty work than the Imperial Guard? "Your servant understands," Tian Urging said, bowing deeply. "I will handle it immediately." He backed away 3 steps, turned, and hurried out of the Qinxing Palace. I sat back at my desk and started calculating my next moves. Since I had traveled back in time to inhabit this body, I had to change the course of history. I couldn't give the Jurchen tribes another chance to enter the Central Plains. Whether it was the Donglin Party or any other political faction, they all had to vanish under the absolute power of the throne. This era didn't need democracy or freedom of speech. It needed the entire country to clench into a single iron fist. Only then could I strike wherever I wanted. The West had already begun the age of discovery, sailing the world for gold. The great Ming needed to join that race. "Your Majesty," A sob broke my train of thought. I looked up and saw a stunning woman standing at the entrance. She looked to be in her early 20s, wearing a grand, flowing phoenix robe that couldn't hide her slender figure. Tears streaked her pale cheeks. She gripped the doorframe with one hand and held up her skirt with the other, her breathing heavy as if she had run the whole way. Her phoenix crown was tilted to the side, looking like it might fall at any moment. Even though I didn't recognize her face, I knew her identity instantly. This was Zhang Yin, the Empress. I felt a wave of awkwardness wash over me. I had taken over this man's body, and now I had to face his wife. As a decent man from the 21st century, I felt a twinge of shame. Your Majesty, you really came back to life? Her voice trembled, thick with tears. You scared me to death. She stepped over the threshold and ran toward me, but her long skirt caught in a gap in the floorboards. She tripped, her body tilting forward. I couldn't just sit there. I braced my hand on the jade desk and flipped right over the top of it. I reached her in 3 quick strides and caught her, carefully helping her up. Are you okay? Are you hurt? I asked, my voice tight with genuine concern. Zhang Yin didn't care about the fall. She just looked up at me, her eyes blurry with tears, and reached out a trembling hand to touch my face. Your Majesty, it really is you. You're actually alive. Do you know what these last few days have been like for me? If I didn't have to protect the Empire for you, I would have followed you to the grave. She buried her head in my chest and began to sob uncontrollably. I stood there, completely frozen. My hands hovered in the air, not knowing whether to hug her or push her away. The scent of her perfume filled my nose, making my head spin. Back in my previous life, I was a firearms engineer. I spent my days in workshops dealing with barrels and triggers. I had never even been in a relationship. To be thrown into a situation like this right after crossing over left me totally lost. I knew who Zhang Yin was from the history books. She was beautiful, famed as one of the 5 great empresses of Chinese history, but she was also incredibly capable. If it wasn't for her protecting the next emperor, the Ming dynasty might have collapsed even sooner. Having such a beauty crying in my arms. If I said I didn't feel anything, I'd be lying to myself. After a long moment, I gently pushed her back and tried to change the subject. Stop crying now. See, I'm alive. I didn't actually die. I was just called away by the old ancestor, Zhu Yuanzhang, to be scolded. You wouldn't believe it. The old man gave me a real earful. He almost didn't let me come back. Zhang Yin blinked, stunned. The old ancestor? I nodded and forced a smile. Guess why he finally let me go? She shook her head, looking at me with pure curiosity. Why? Her voice was like music, and seeing her face so close, I felt myself starting to give in to the moment. I pulled her back into a hug and whispered. I told the old ancestor that the wives of our Zhu family are the most beautiful women under heaven. You know he wasn't the best-looking guy, so he wants his descendants to have the best. Once he heard that, he practically kicked me out of heaven to get back to you. Zhang Yin let out a sudden laugh, even though tears were still in her eyes. She looked up at me in surprise. It's only been a few days, but your Majesty's tongue has grown quite smooth. You've learned how to tease me. She buried her face in my chest again. At that moment, she looked truly happy. All the worry and grief of the past few days seemed to vanish. Outside, the guards had long since closed the doors to give us privacy. The palace was silent, save for the sound of our breathing. It was August, and the heat was stifling. After holding her for a while, sweat began to bead on my forehead. I gently nudged her. It's too hot. Let's hold each other tonight, okay? Zhang Yin shook her head stubbornly. No, I'm afraid if I let go, I won't be able to find you again. I had no choice but to endure the heat while enjoying the affection. Eventually, a guard's voice came from outside, announcing that the Grand Secretary, Huang Liji, was asking for an audience. Zhang Yin finally let go, her face flushed a deep red. She tucked a stray hair behind her ear, looking shy but hopeful. I'll head back first. Will your Majesty come tonight and tell me more stories about the old ancestor? Go on, I nodded. I'll be there. She left through the back door with a radiant smile. As soon as she was gone, I barked toward the entrance. Let him in. The doors opened, and the elderly Huang Liji walked in, his head bowed. Your Majesty, the funeral ceremony has been halted. How should we explain this to the people? I glared at him, annoyed. I already gave the reason at the palace gate. Just repeat that. You interrupted me for this nonsense? Do you have no initiative at all? Huang Liji gasped. I rarely lost my temper, and he wasn't prepared for the bite in my voice. Don't disturb me with such trivial matters in the future. I snapped. The imperial court pays you well. If I have to make every tiny decision myself, what use do I have for you? Huang Liji panicked, bowing frantically. This servant is incompetent. I deserve death. Please, your majesty, forgive me. He scrambled out of the room as fast as his old legs could carry him. I watched his retreating back, my eyes burning with frustration. I honestly felt like kicking him. I watched Huang Liji scramble away and sighed. The man was ancient. If he wasn't going to retire and spend his final years playing with his grandkids, what was the point of staying in power? I didn't have time to dwell on him. I ordered my attendants to bring me the recent memorials and reports. They brought in 10 massive wooden crates, packed to the brim with scrolls. I flipped one open. It was a formal inquiry about my health. I opened another. Same thing. I kept digging, but it was just an endless pile of useless greetings and polite nonsense. Trash. All of it, I shouted, tossing the scrolls into the air. They fluttered like dying birds before hitting the floor. I spent half the day digging through the mountain of paper until I finally found a legitimate report from the governor of Guangxi. I read it and felt my blood pressure spike. The governor, a man named Huang Un, had sent a high-priority courier to tell me that it had rained 7 times in Nanning during the month of June. He even specified the depth, 9 inches and 2 fractions. Is this guy insane? I muttered. I tossed it aside and grabbed his next report. July, it rained twice. August, I didn't even finish reading. I snapped. Someone get in here. I warned. A guard rushed in, trembling. Go find that old fossil Huang Liji and drag him back here. Now, minutes later, a sweating, panting Huang Liji stood before me again. Before he could even bow, I started screaming. Issue an order to every provincial official. Tell them if they send me one more piece of useless garbage like this, I'll have their heads. Do they think courier horses and official stationery are free? I whipped the rain report at his face. It hit him square in the nose. It takes 20 days for a messenger to get here from Guangxi. All that effort just to tell me it rained? You're the Grand Secretary. How can you let this incompetence slide? This is a total failure of leadership. Huang Liji backed out of the room, clutching the scroll, looking completely dazed. He couldn't understand it. Since when did I care about paperwork? I used to spend all my time on carpentry and leave the boring stuff to the eunuch Wei Zhongxian. He shook his head as he walked back to the inner cabinet. He wondered if I really had been lectured by our great ancestor while I was dead. He didn't want to believe in ghosts, but he couldn't explain why I had suddenly turned into a workaholic tyrant. Back at the cabinet office, the other officials crowded around him. How did it go, Elder? They asked. Huang Liji dropped the scroll on the table and rubbed his temples. He's alive, all right. But his personality has flipped. He's actually processing government affairs now. He even scolded the governor of Guangxi for wasting resources. He didn't bother hiding his frustration. Everyone in this room belonged to Wei Zhongxian's faction anyway. One official, Shifeng Lai, just waved his hand dismissively. A leopard doesn't change its spots. He's probably just excited because he survived a brush with death. It won't last. My servants found a set of world-class carpentry tools. I'll send them to Wei Zhongxian to give to the emperor. In a few days, he'll be back to carving wood and ignoring us. The others nodded in agreement. They were sure I was just having a momentary lapse in my usual laziness. But back in the palace of heavenly purity, I wasn't playing around. I sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by paper. I filtered through the junk until I had a small pile of about 100 scrolls. These were my only real windows into the state of the Ming dynasty. The news wasn't good. Shanxi was suffering from a massive drought. A rebel named Wang Er had gathered a mob and sacked a city. Meanwhile, some brown-noser named Lu Wanling was asking for permission to build a shrine for Wei Zhongxian inside the Imperial Academy, right next to Confucius. On the other hand, a few brave souls were actually reporting Wei's crimes, while an official in Nanjing was begging for a crackdown on corruption and more focus on farming. My head throbbed. History books said the last emperor, Chongzhen, worked himself to the bone for 17 years and still lost the empire. He was a workaholic, but a terrible leader. I wasn't going to make that mistake. I marked the important files and called a young eunuch over. "Pack these up," I said, pointing to the useless ones. "Don't lose a single one." I stood up and stretched. My stomach growled. I had been busy all day and hadn't eaten a thing, and this body had been sitting in a coffin for 2 days before that. The state of the empire could wait until tomorrow. I needed food. I headed toward the Cunning Palace, the residence of the Empress. As I approached, the guards saw my dragon robes and started screaming at the top of their lungs. "The Emperor has arrived." I nearly jumped out of my skin. I marched over and kicked the guard right in the dirt. "Shut up. If you scream like that again, I'll have you sweeping the streets for a month." The guard turned pale and started thanking me for my mercy. I wasn't actually that angry. I was just trying to joke around like I would with a coworker in my past life. But seeing the sheer terror in his eyes, and the way Wei Zhongxian and Huang Liji acted around me, reminded me of a harsh truth. Being the emperor meant being truly alone. One joke could scare a man to death. The palace doors opened, and Zhang Yin stepped out, flanked by a dozen maids and eunuchs. They all knelt in unison. "I welcome your majesty," she said softly. "Rise," I said. I still wasn't used to the bowing, but I knew I had to maintain my dignity. Zhang Yin stood up and naturally reached out her hand. I took it, feeling how soft her skin was, and led her inside. The maids behind us whispered in shock. The old me would have only let her touch my sleeve or wrist. Holding her hand like this was unheard of. Zhang Yan's face glowed with a tiny, secret smile. She wondered if the great ancestor really had scolded me into becoming a better husband. I had no idea what she was thinking. I was just hungry. To her, holding hands was a small, natural gesture between a husband and wife. But as we sat down in the Cunning Palace, my stomach let out a roar like a hungry beast. Zhang Yin looked at me with immediate guilt. She blamed herself for forgetting that I hadn't eaten a real meal in days. She almost sent for the imperial kitchen, but then changed her mind. She decided to go to her private small kitchen to cook for me herself. In the Ming Dynasty, empresses were chosen for their virtue, often coming from ordinary families. Being able to manage a household and a kitchen was the bare minimum. The imperial kitchen was slow, and the food was usually mediocre anyway. Most high-ranking concubines kept their own kitchens for moments like this. As Zhang Yin stood up to leave, I reached out and grabbed her hand. I told her not to bother. Today, I was going to be the one doing the cooking. The room went silent. Every maid and eunuch stood there with their jaws dropped. Even Zhang Yin looked like she'd seen a ghost. I just laughed. I asked them if they really didn't believe I could cook. I told them a half-truth. I claimed that during my time with the great ancestor, he had shared some of his favorite recipes with me, dishes he used to make for the great-grandmother herself. In reality, I was just starving. I'd been stuck in a coffin for 3 days, and my stomach was sticking to my spine. I knew the palace food was tasteless, and I wasn't going to let my own tongue suffer. I was the emperor, after all. I led Zhang Yin to the small kitchen. She was still in a daze, wondering why the historical records never mentioned the great ancestor being a chef. When she saw me pick up a knife and start chopping vegetables with professional speed, she panicked. She tried to stop me, terrified of what the court officials would say if they found out the emperor was doing manual labor. I just glared at her. I told her if anyone dared to talk trash, I'd personally tear their mouths apart. That shut her up pretty quickly. She was probably worried that if she argued too much, I'd drop dead again from the stress. So, we worked together. I cooked, and she washed the vegetables and tended the fire. Soon, the room was filled with the mouth-watering scent of home-cooked food. I plated everything up: braised pork, yellow lamb, vinegar-glazed cabbage, and cold cucumbers. Zhang Yin was stunned. She stared at the food like it was a miracle. I put a piece of braised pork in my bowl and nodded. It was perfect. I told her the great ancestor was actually famous for his beggar's chicken, but since we didn't have the ingredients, this would have to do. She didn't ask any more questions. She just kept smiling and piling food into my bowl. I had to stop her and force a piece of lamb into her own mouth. She tasted it, and her eyes lit up. Maybe it was the flavor, or maybe it was just the shock, but she looked like she'd never tasted anything better in her life. She kept trying to feed me instead of herself. It was ridiculous. I finally had to get aggressive with the chopsticks, shoveling lamb and fish into her bowl until she finally looked up with a pout. She told me she couldn't eat another bite. She had a few grains of rice stuck to the corner of her mouth. In that moment, she didn't look like a dignified empress. She looked like a real person. As night fell, we changed into silk robes and sat out in the courtyard. The stars were out, and a rare cool breeze drifted through the palace. It was the most peaceful I'd felt since arriving here. Zhang Yin leaned her head on my shoulder. She asked me to tell her more about my conversations with the great ancestor. I started making up stories, but as I talked, the real history of the Ming dynasty started slipping out. I told her about the coming years. I told her about the massive droughts in Shaanxi that would turn the land into a wasteland. I told her about the plague that would sweep through the north, killing millions. I told her about the rebellions and the Jurchen invaders who were waiting at the borders. The warm atmosphere vanished. Zhang Yin covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She asked if the great ancestor had really shown me all of this. I just nodded, feeling a heavy weight in my chest. For some reason, I felt like I could tell this woman anything. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. She told me she was useless because she couldn't help me like the great-grandmother helped the great ancestor. She urged me to go back to the palace and start working immediately. She was willing to give up our time together if it meant saving the country. I laughed and told her I wasn't going anywhere. These problems couldn't be fixed in a single night, and I was already making preparations. I wasn't about to go back and sleep on a cold mat alone in that giant palace. I'd rather stay here and sweat with her. She didn't try to push me away again, but she stayed quiet, her heart clearly heavy with the thought of the suffering citizens outside the walls. We sat there for a long time. Eventually, I heard a tiny, rhythmic sound. I looked down and realized she had fallen fast asleep in my arms. It was actually pretty cute. I picked Zhang Yin up and carried her back into the inner hall. With the help of the palace maids, I laid her gently on the bed. I sat by her side for a moment, watching her sleep. A sudden wave of pity washed over me. She was only 21. In the world I came from, girls that age were still in university, chasing romance and living without a care. But here, Zhang Yin bore the weight of a heavy copper crown. It was a burden that was clearly breaking her. The night passed quietly. I didn't even realize when I eventually fell asleep. I only woke up when I heard a rhythmic clinking sound nearby. I opened my eyes slowly. Zhang Yin had already changed into a long dress embroidered with colorful phoenixes. She was setting the table for breakfast. When she saw me wake up, she rushed over to help me wash. I used a toothbrush made of pig bristles and some herbal paste. It didn't foam much, but the taste was mild. Then, I looked at the meal on the table. I froze. There were a few blackened sorghum buns, a small dish of pickles, and a single bowl of millet porridge. Compared to last night's feast, this was a joke. This wasn't food for an emperor. Zhang Yin bowed deeply. She told me my stories from last night had terrified her. She had decided that starting today, we had to live as frugally as possible. Every bite we saved was a bite that could save a citizen when the disasters arrived. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I hadn't even had a chance to enjoy my new life, and now I was being put on a diet. What kind of karma was this? But looking at her sincere eyes, I couldn't argue. I sat down and bit into a black bun. It was terrible. The texture was so coarse it felt like swallowing sandpaper. As soon as I finished, I made an excuse about official business and bolted. I was honestly afraid she'd serve me something even worse for lunch. Saving grain was important, but I didn't want to suffer this much. I walked toward the palace of heavenly purity and noticed a lot of eunuchs scurrying in and out of the hall of mental cultivation. I decided to take a look. When they saw me, they all dropped to their knees. I waved them off and stepped inside. The place was a mess of paper. Mountains of memorials were piled on the tables and categories. Some were about disaster relief. Others were officials snitching on each other. And some were just congratulating me on coming back to life. The history books were right. The original Zhu Yuxiao was a lazy ruler who spent all his time on woodworking. He had dumped everything on Wei Zhongxian. This hall, which was supposed to be the emperor's office, had basically become Wei's headquarters. I didn't leave. I pulled up a chair and started flipping through the scrolls. I used the same method as yesterday. If it was useless garbage, I tossed it. If it was important, I marked it. I wasn't ready to face the full court yet. Those ministers were used to me being absent anyway. Before long, Wei Zhongxian appeared at the door. I grabbed a memorial and threw it. It hit him right in the chest with a loud thud. He nearly jumped out of his skin. When he realized I was the one sitting there, he hit the floor immediately. He started babbling about his failures and my divine grace. He didn't explain where he'd been. He just went straight to begging for forgiveness. It was a classic move, acting like a loyal dog to avoid the whip. I didn't even look at him. I sent a young eunuch to go fetch the scrolls I had reviewed the day before. A few minutes later, the scrolls arrived. I dug through them until I found the one I wanted. It was a petition from two scholars, Lu Wanling and Chao Dai. They wanted to build a shrine for Wei Zhongxian inside the Imperial Academy. They wanted him to be honored right alongside Confucius. I slammed the scroll onto Wei's head. I asked him if his skull was too thick or if he was just tired of living. Wei read it and turned pale. He started stammering that it was a frame-up. He claimed he wouldn't dare compare himself to a saint. I let out a cold snort. Did he really think I was that stupid? Without his permission, no one would dare write something like this. This scroll was dated August 23rd. At that time, I was still dead in a coffin. This wasn't meant for me. It was a test for the next emperor, a way to see if the new guy would let Wei keep his power. Wei froze. He realized I had seen right through him. He slammed his head against the floor. The sound was sickeningly loud. He knew he was in deep trouble. I stood up and kicked him. Hard. He rolled across the floor, knocking over two chairs. I shouted at him. I told him I protected him because he was useful, but if he kept looking for death, I couldn't save him. If this scroll went public, even being sliced to pieces wouldn't be enough to pay for the insult to Confucius. Confucius was a pillar of the nation. Emperors came and went, but the Kong family stayed. Trying to put a eunuch on that level was suicide. Wei was nearly 60, but he was shaking like a leaf. He looked like an old, abandoned dog. People called him the 9,000-year-old lord, but here he was, crawling back to me. He begged for his life, citing his years of service. I didn't actually plan to kill him yet. Killing Wei now would be like cutting off my own arm. I needed his network. I picked up the memorial and tore it into tiny pieces. I told him I'd pretend I never saw it. But I warned him, there wouldn't be a second time. Then I gave him an order. Every eunuch who had seen this scroll and the two scholars who wrote it had to be dealt with. Handle it yourself, I said, my voice cold. Do you understand? It wasn't that I was cruel. I just couldn't afford the risk. If that document ever reached the Kong family, the descendants of Confucius, the court would erupt in a wave of protests I couldn't stop. I was the emperor, sure, but I didn't truly control the board yet. Wei Zhongxian was ecstatic. He slammed his head against the floor again, this time in gratitude. Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you for your heavenly mercy. I shot him a sideways glance and walked back to my chair. My eyes drifted over the piles of memorials on the desk. Something felt off. I stood up again and started digging through the scrolls I had read yesterday. I remembered most of them, but one was missing. I flipped through the stack until I found it. A report about a man named Wang Er starting a rebellion in Shaanxi. It clicked. I sat back down and looked at Wei Zhongxian with a playful, dangerous smile. I hear your family fortune is quite substantial, I remarked. You've raked in a lot of silver over the years, haven't you? Wei's joy vanished instantly. He looked like he'd been dropped into a hole in the ice. I wouldn't dare hide it from you, Your Majesty. I have a little. But don't worry. If you need it, I'll give it all up. I have no family outside these walls. Money is useless to me. I nodded. At least he was smart. I don't care how much you took or how you got it. When you get back, send your men south to Guangxi. Find the merchants. Buy grain. Buy as much as you can. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. The amount of favor I give you in the future depends entirely on how much grain you bring back. But remember this. I want grain that was bought and paid for. If I find out a single kernel was stolen from a farmer, I'll have your head. Wei Zhongxian exhaled, visibly relieved. He thought I was going to execute him for corruption, but I just wanted supplies. Yes, Your Majesty. I'll go gather the silver immediately. I won't let you down. He heard me loud and clear. Favor in exchange for food. I had never spoken to him like this before, and he knew how much this mattered to me. I was satisfied. He finally knew his place. The men I asked for yesterday, I asked. Have they left for Shaanxi? Yes, they have. Keep it quiet, I warned. I don't want anyone to know. When you find them, bring them straight to the Eastern Depot. Treat them well. Be polite. The future of the Great Ming depends on them. Wei didn't understand. They were just a few commoners. How could they affect the fate of the empire? But after the beating I'd just given him, he didn't dare ask. He stayed prostrate on the floor, his forehead bruised and swollen. Rest assured, Your Majesty, I'll handle it perfectly. Go then. Wei got up and walked out of the hall of mental cultivation, his mind a mess. His emotions had been on a roller coaster all morning. If he had a weak heart, he would have dropped dead right there. Even under the blazing sun, he felt a chill. He had served the emperor for years. In his memory, the young ruler was easy to manipulate. A few tricks were usually enough to keep him happy. But since he returned from the dead, yesterday, everything had changed. He felt like a stranger. Was it true? Had the great ancestor really taught him the art of ruling in the afterlife? Wei shook the thought away. It didn't matter. He just had to get the job done. As soon as he reached the Eastern Depot, he summoned his entire network. The room filled up quickly with powerful officials. There was the Minister of War, Cui Qingxiu, and the Minister of Works, Wu Chuanfu. There were generals from the Brocade Guards like Tian Urjin and Su Xianshan. Even the 10 dogs of the Yin Party were there. The room was packed. The lower-ranking officials had to stand outside. Wei sat beneath a statue, his face bruised and battered. He wasn't embarrassed. In fact, the others looked at him with envy. Those bruises were from the emperor. In this world, being hit by the emperor was a sign of closeness. How many people in the Ming dynasty were even important enough for the king to lay a hand on them? Tian Urjin stepped forward and bowed. Lord Wei, why have you called us? What are your orders? Wei stroked a strand of white hair near his temple. He let his gaze linger on every face in the room. The emperor has given me a task. We are going south to buy grain. Cui Qingxiu looked confused. But the Ministry of Revenue is out of money. Wei shook his head. We aren't using the ministry's money. I'm using my own. I'm selling my lands and my houses outside the palace. Every cent I have is going toward grain. I called you here to see who among you is comfortable enough to help me out. Tian Urjin frowned. Selling your property? Just for grain? Is this really necessary? The others stared in shock. They had never seen Wei this desperate. Wei sighed. The emperor said my future depends on how much grain I bring back. If I fail, my good days are over. The realization hit them like a physical blow. If Wei fell, they all fell. I have 2,000 taels, one shouted. I'll send someone home to get my savings right now. I can give 20,000. I only have 500, but it's yours. In the future history I remembered, the last emperor would beg these same officials for money to save the country, and they would only scrape together 200,000 taels. But here, with Wei Zhongxian's life on the line, they were throwing fortunes at him. 10,000 here, 5,000 there. In less than an hour, the total reached 1.3 million taels of silver. They knew the truth. If Wei went down, the purge would come for them next. Money is useless if you're dead. By that night, a massive convoy rolled out of the Forbidden City. Wei had managed to pull together 3 million taels in half a day. 1,000 agents from the Eastern Depot and 500 musketeers from the capital garrison escorted the silver south. Over the next few days, I stayed away from the morning court sessions. I spent my time in the palace, reading reports and drawing. But I hated using brushes. They were clumsy and slow. I needed something better. I headed over to the Ministry of Works. When the minister, Wu Chuanfu, saw me coming, he scrambled to lead his staff outside. They all hit the ground in a synchronized thud. We pay our respects to Your Majesty. Long live the Emperor. I looked down at the sea of kneeling officials. It was time to start building. Wu Chuanfu had rounded up every single person in the Ministry of Works, whether they were busy or not. He didn't know why I had suddenly arrived, and he looked terrified that I was there to cause trouble. At ease, I said, waving them off. Go back to whatever you were doing. Why the big display? If you do this again, I'll have you removed from office. I wasn't happy with the spectacle. To me, a craftsman should have the spirit of a true creator. Even if the sky was falling, the work in their hands should be the only thing that mattered. Back when I was a designer in my past life, I used to snap at my bosses if they interrupted my drawing. Wu Chuanfu hurried to disperse the crowd and led me into the main hall of the ministry. I'm here because I need something made, I said, getting straight to the point. I needed pencils. Brushes are a national treasure, sure, but I preferred the efficiency of a pencil. You can write or draw anywhere, and it saves paper. I explained exactly what I wanted while I sat back and sipped some tea. Wu Chuanfu didn't dare delay. He gathered a group of the best craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, and silversmiths. I described the shape and the function, but honestly, I didn't know the exact science of making them. The craftsmen huddled together. They were brilliant. Once I gave them the direction, they started brainstorming immediately. The emperor wants a tool that leaves a black mark on paper, one said. We can use graphite or carbon powder for the core. No, another countered. Graphite alone is too hard to shape. We need a binder. Resin? Fish glue. Glue won't work. It'll coat the graphite and stop it from marking the paper. Then mix clay with the graphite powder, a third suggested. Add water to shape it, then fire it in the kiln. They were fast. Within minutes, they had a plan. They took a cylindrical piece of wood and split it down the middle. That was the easy part. The real challenge was the ratio of clay to graphite. Too much clay, and the pencil would be too hard to write with. Too little, and it would be so soft it would snap under pressure. With the minister's seal, they had unlimited access to the warehouse. They split into groups to test different ratios. In less than an hour, 5 sample pencils were placed on the table before me. They were about 7 inches long, made of pine that still smelled of fresh resin. I picked one up, sharpened it with a knife, and drew a line. It was clear, but the lead felt scratchy. I tried the second one. The line was lighter and even harder. After testing all 5, I nodded. These were perfect. I could even categorize them like the modern scale. H, B, 2B. The only thing missing was an eraser, but that didn't matter. Holding that pencil, I felt like I was back at my old job. I started drawing on a fresh sheet of paper. I was sketching the last thing I had worked on before I died, an improved blueprint for a Type 95 automatic rifle. The Ming Dynasty didn't have the technology to build this yet, but I wanted it on paper. I wanted it ready for the day we could. Wu Chuanfu leaned in, staring at the paper with confusion. He saw dense lines, Arabic numerals, and strange symbols he didn't recognize. He looked at me with newfound awe. The rumors must be true, he probably thought. The great ancestor really did teach me divine secrets during my 3 days of death. But then I frowned. My tools were failing me. The Ming Dynasty used 3 different types of rulers, and none of them were consistent. The smallest unit of measurement was about 0.32 centimeters. That wasn't nearly precise enough for firearms. Just as I was about to order new rulers, a eunuch entered. Your Majesty, Tian Urgent seeks an audience. I tucked the unfinished blueprint into my robe. Whatever the head of the secret police wanted, it was too important to discuss in front of the Ministry of Works. Back at the Qinxing Palace, Tian Urgent stood before several heavy chests. Your Majesty, everything you asked for is here, he said. The boxes were filled with files on every official in the imperial court. How many acres of land they owned, how many houses, how many concubines, and exactly how much silver they had hidden away. It even detailed every bribe they had ever taken, dates, names, and amounts. I smiled. This was exactly what I needed to break them. Spread the word, I commanded. Tomorrow morning, we hold court outside the Huangji Gate. August 30th, the 7th year of Tianqi. It was my 7th day in this world. At dawn, the palace maids dressed me in my formal dragon robes. Court wasn't held in a fancy room like in the movies. It was held in the open space outside the Huangji Gate. When I arrived, my chair and a table piled high with the files from the secret police were already waiting. I sat down, and Wei Zhongxian let out a thunderous shout toward the Meridian Gate. By imperial decree, the officials shall enter. Drums rolled 3 times. The massive gates swung open. The civil and military officials marched in, forming 2 long lines according to their rank. They knelt in unison, their voices echoing through the square. Long live the emperor! Long live, long live, long live! I waved my hand, mimicking the gestures I'd seen in dramas. Rise! We thank your majesty. The pleasantries were over. Now, the real work began. The officials stood in silence, their heads bowed low. I could feel their confusion radiating off the stone courtyard. For 30 years, the emperors of the Ming Dynasty had barely shown their faces at court. The previous Tianqi was no different, spending his days lost in carpentry while Wei Zhongxian ran the empire into the ground. Now, I was sitting here, staring them down. There were hundreds of them. I scanned their faces, searching for any sign of what they were thinking. Some looked bewildered. Others looked excited or hopeful. A few just looked annoyed. I cleared my throat and stood up slowly, tucking my hands behind my back as I walked to the edge of the stairs. I know what's going through your heads, I said, my voice echoing. But let me be clear. From today on, morning court is back on the schedule. I will be here on the 3rd, 6th, and 9th of every month. If you have business, speak up. Let's get started. I sat back down as 2 young eunuchs hurried to slide my chair behind me. The officials traded nervous glances. Finally, Huang Liji, the head of the Grand Secretariat, stepped forward. Your Majesty, I have a report, he said. 10 days ago, a rebel named Wang Er captured Chongqing County in Shaanxi. He murdered the local magistrate in front of a crowd. I believe we must send the army immediately. I already knew this. I had seen the reports in the files, but I wanted to see how my ministers handled it. I turned to the man in charge of the military, the Minister of War, Cui Qingxiu. Minister Cui, I said, what is the War Office's plan? Cui Qingxiu looked like a deer in headlights. He wasn't a general. He was a sycophant who had flattered his way to the top by sucking up to Wei Zhongxian. He didn't know the first thing about Shaanxi geography. He didn't even know where the nearest troops were stationed. He started sweating, his eyes darting around for help. Answer me, I pressured. I believe we should move troops from Yulin to crush them, Your Majesty, he stammered. I felt a surge of anger. Yulin? Tell me, how far is Yulin from Chongqing? How long will it take for those troops to arrive? He froze. He had no idea. He realized he was trapped and hit the ground, kneeling in a panic. Please, Your Majesty, I do not know. I let out a cold, sharp laugh. I pointed at him, my voice dropping to a dangerous level. You are the Minister of War. You manage the defense of my empire, yet you know nothing of your own soldiers? Fine. If you're useless, I don't need you. I looked at the guards. Drag this man out and behead him. The entire square went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Behead a high-ranking minister? That didn't happen in the Ming dynasty. The officials stared at each other in horror. The Wei Zhongxian faction wanted to plead for him, but they were too terrified to move. Before the guards could grab him, Wei Zhongxian finally stepped forward. Your Majesty, he said, bowing low. Minister Cui was negligent, yes. But execution seems extreme. Perhaps 50 lashes and a loss of rank would suffice. I didn't answer right away. I walked down the steps, moving slowly until I was standing right in front of Wei Zhongxian. Then, I didn't say a word. I just raised my leg and kicked him as hard as I could. The old man went flying. He crashed onto the cold stone floor, clutching his stomach. I didn't even look at him. I turned back to the guards. Did I stutter? Take him to the gate. Now. The guards didn't hesitate a second time. They grabbed Cui Qingxiu by the arms and dragged him away. He started screaming, begging for mercy, claiming he was innocent. I didn't blink. I watched him disappear, knowing that every official in that square was now wondering if they were next. The sun was rising, but the mood was freezing. I could see the wheels turning in the heads of the different political factions. To the enemies of the eunuchs, this was the best news they'd heard in years. To Wei Zhongxian's followers, it was a death knell. I turned my attention to the next man, Guo Yunho, the Minister of Revenue. How much grain is left in the national treasury? I asked. Guo Yunho looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole. He stepped out and bowed until his forehead nearly touched the ground. Your Majesty, there is no grain. The war in the north has emptied our stores. The treasury is so empty that even the rats have moved out. I expected as much. You're lucky I'm in a productive mood, I said. I've heard of a crop from the overseas colonies called the sweet potato. It's hardy. It grows in dry soil and bad land. I'm giving you 3 years. I want this crop planted across the entire empire to stop the famine. If you fail, you'll join Minister Cui at the gate. Guo Yunho shook with relief. I will do it, Your Majesty. I swear it. But I will need help. I need Su Guanqi. He is an expert in agriculture and has studied this crop before. I knew the name. Su Guanqi was a legendary scholar and a brilliant mind. Granted, I said. As of this moment, Su Guanqi is the Vice Minister of Revenue. Get to work. I watched the officials' faces change as the realization hit them. It was a masterpiece of shifting expressions. One man, Cui Qingxiu, had just lost his head. Yet Guo Yunho, who served the same master, walked away with a promotion. They couldn't wrap their heads around it. For decades, these men had played the game of factional politics. You were either with the eunuchs or against them. To them, the person mattered more than the work. But I wasn't playing their game. Cui Qingxiu was a useless flatterer, so he died. Guo Yunho actually knew how to run a treasury, so he lived. It was that simple. I saw a few clever eyes in the crowd flicker with understanding, but most stayed silent. They knew better than to speak. The capital was breached by rebels, I said, my voice echoing across the square as I scanned the crowd. That needs to be fixed. Where are Sun Qingzong and Sun Chuanting? Wei Zhongxian scrambled to his feet, bowing low. Your Majesty. Both of them resigned and returned to their hometowns. I glared at him. I didn't need to ask why. It was the eunuch factions that had driven the competent men away. Bring them back to Beijing immediately, I barked. Sun Qingzong is the new Minister of War. Sun Chuanting will be his deputy, and I want him in Shaanxi to wipe out those bandits. Wei Zhongxian froze. Those two men were his sworn enemies. Giving them control of the military was like handing them a sword to cut his throat. He looked at the other officials, hoping someone would protest, but no one dared move. He had just watched me execute one of his top guys. He didn't know if he was next. I obey your command, he stammered, retreating back into the line of officials and closing his eyes, trying to look invisible. Seeing Wei Zhongxian cower gave the other factions a sudden burst of courage. A censor stepped forward, his eyes bright with ambition. Your Majesty, I have a petition. I impeach Wei Zhongxian for his crimes. I felt a smirk tugging at my lips. Oh, tell me more. What has the old dog done wrong? Hearing me call him an old dog was like pouring gasoline on a fire. The censor grew ecstatic. He launched into a rehearsed speech, listing 10 deadly sins. He accused Wei of controlling the government, deceiving the emperor, and building a private army. It was a perfect list, the kind of thing they had probably prepared months ago for the next emperor. He finished his speech, face flushed, heart racing. He probably thought he was a hero. He probably thought he was watching Wei Zhongxian's final moments. I didn't say a word. I just waited. Sure enough, the floodgates opened. Your Majesty, I also impeach him, another shouted. He extorts the merchants, cried a third. He treats the people like slaves. One by one, they jumped out. Members of the Donglin Party, the Qi Party, the Chu Party. Everyone who wasn't a eunuch supporter was suddenly a champion of justice. 80% of the officials were now screaming for Wei Zhongxian's blood. Wei's face went from pale to ghostly white. I could see him shaking. He was sweating so hard his robes were soaked, and I noticed a wet patch forming on the ground beneath him. He had literally pissed himself. He thought I was using these officials to finish him off. But I knew the truth about these virtuous men. The eunuch faction only grew powerful because the other parties were so corrupt and exclusionary that they forced everyone else into Wei's arms. These men weren't heroes. They were just another brand of vulture. I looked at the screaming officials with pure contempt. They thought they were winning. They didn't realize they were just identifying themselves for me. Tian Urgin, I said, cutting through the noise. I am here, Your Majesty, my secret police commander replied. Get the files on these men. All of them. The crowd went silent. Tian Urgin walked into the hall and returned with a stack of ledgers, the same ones I had been studying. Don't bother giving them to me, I said. Read them out loud. Let everyone hear. Tian Urgin's voice was cold and clear. Censor Zhu Guanghui bought his position for 500 taels of silver, used his power to extort 4,000 taels from local officials, owns 7 luxury villas and over 10 concubines. We found 70,000 taels of silver hidden in his home. The censor who had started the shouting match began to tremble. Vice Minister Mao Songwang, Tian continued, accepted massive bribes, owns 8 estates across the empire and 4,000 acres of land. We found 230,000 taels of silver in his basement. The air in the square turned icy. This wasn't an execution of the eunuchs. It was a trap. I had waited for them to jump out and show their faces, and they had walked right into it. Mao Songwang collapsed to his knees, his forehead hitting the stones with a dull thud. Your Majesty, I. He couldn't even finish the sentence. The hunter had become the prey. This is not the way of a wise ruler, one official shouted, his face red with indignation. We are here to discuss the crimes of Wei Zhongxian. Why has the focus shifted to us? If this becomes the precedent, who will ever dare to speak for the people again? Your Majesty, you are openly shielding a criminal. As soon as he finished, the sound of knees hitting stone echoed through the square. One by one, the officials who had been attacking Wei Zhongxian knelt down. Please, Your Majesty, reconsider, they cried in unison. It wasn't just the critics. Even the officials who usually crawled at Wei Zhongxian's feet were trembling. They looked at the wooden crates filled with ledgers and felt a cold sweat breaking out. When were these files prepared? Why hadn't Wei Zhongxian warned them? Every man there wondered if his own secrets were buried in those pages. I raised my hand, signaling Tian Urgent to stop reading. I looked down at the kneeling crowd with a cold, mocking smile. Openly shielding him. I repeated, yes, I am openly shielding him. What of it? My voice grew louder, echoing off the palace walls. I pointed a finger at Wei Zhongxian, who was shrinking into a corner, looking like a cornered rat. For 7 years, where did the silver for our border soldiers come from? I demanded. It was him. It was Wei Zhongxian who squeezed every single copper out of the wealthy families in the south. He is the one who fed my hundreds of thousands of soldiers. For that alone, I will not only protect him, I will ensure he lives to a ripe old age. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto theirs. Remember this. I want people who get things done. I don't want useless trash who only know how to wag their tongues. I'll give you one chance. All your family assets will be confiscated into the national treasury. Then, you will be sent to Shangxi or Shangxi. Pick a district and serve as a magistrate. If you do well, you might return to the capital one day. If you fail, you can die there. Just don't let me see your faces again. Despair washed over them. In the past, the Donglin faction might have had the power to push back against the emperor, but they had been purged and broken. The remaining factions were weak and unorganized. They hated my decree, but they had to swallow it. Still, some weren't ready to go down without a fight. Your Majesty, Mao Songguang, the Vice Minister of Personnel, crawled forward and slammed his forehead against the ground. I admit my crimes. I will take the punishment. But the disaster of Wei Zhongxian is a plague upon the world. I beg you to execute him. He knew he couldn't deny the evidence Tian Urgent held. This was his last-ditch effort. If we are gone, who will be left to speak the truth against him? Mao shouted, his voice cracking. I am willing to trade the lives of all 54 members of my household for Wei Zhongxian's death. Please, Your Majesty, reconsider. The square went silent. Even I was surprised. The officials from the eunuch faction were shocked. This man was insane. But the scholars and critics looked at Mao with pure admiration. To them, this was the ultimate act of a gentleman. This was true courage. Your Majesty, add my family of 73, another cried out. And mine, 84 lives. I felt a surge of rage. I wanted to kill them all right then and there. There were about 300 officials at the assembly, and nearly half of them had jumped out to demand Wei Zhongxian's head. I wasn't the founding emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang. I didn't have the political capital to start a bloodbath and let heads roll by the thousands. That's why I had offered them a way out. Pay for your lives with silver and service. But these idiots were back at it, trying to trade their lives for eternal fame. If I killed them now, they would get exactly what they wanted. They would be remembered as martyrs who defied a tyrant. Their corruption would be forgotten, and I would be the villain in every history book. I didn't mind being a tyrant, but I wasn't going to be a martyr's stepping stone for free. I walked down the steps, my face a mask of ice, and stopped right in front of Mao Songguang. You are truly willing to trade 54 lives to kill Wei Zhongxian? I asked softly. I will not go back on my word. Mao replied firmly. I nodded. Fine. Killing that old dog isn't impossible. And I don't even need your family's lives. I just need you to solve one problem. The military budget for the 9 border commands. Can you do it? Mao froze. The words died in his throat. He could brag about dying for a cause all day, but raising millions in silver for an army? He had no idea how. If he tried to collect taxes from the southern merchants like Wei Zhongxian did, the very officials kneeling next to him would tear him apart before he even left the Forbidden City. He'd be cutting off their own family's cash flow. I turned to the others. What about the rest of you? Who can raise the 8 million taels we need every year? Step forward. If even one of you can do it, I'll take Wei Zhongxian's head right now. Every single official pulled their neck back. Nobody moved. This wasn't something you could bluff your way through. I laughed, a sound full of contempt. What? No one. You bunch of incompetents. You can't raise a single tail, yet you want me to kill the only man who can. Do you want my soldiers to starve? Do you want the Mongols and the Jurchens to slaughter our people because the army has no clothes or food? How are you any different from traitors? I straightened my robes. I'll say it one last time. I want results, not rhetoric. Guards, drag them to the Ministry of Personnel. Assign them their posts and get them out of my sight. Yes, Your Majesty. Tion Urgent roared. The secret police swarmed in. They grabbed the struggling officials like they were nothing more than squawking chickens and dragged them out of the square. The remaining officials, mostly neutral parties or Wei's cronies, watched in absolute terror. I had just replaced nearly half of the capital's bureaucracy with a single sentence. Everyone knew the border provinces were suffering from years of famine. Sending these pampered officials, there was practically a death sentence. They'd be lucky if they weren't eaten by starving refugees halfway there. I walked back to my throne and sat down, watching the survivors. I wanted to replace all of them. I even wanted to get rid of Wei Zhongxian. But logic told me I couldn't push too hard. If I did, these men would stop fighting each other and unite against me. It wouldn't be the first time an emperor suddenly fell ill after crossing the bureaucracy. Wei Zhongxian was the first to break the silence. He knelt down, his voice trembling. Master, all these vacant positions, how should we fill them? I glanced at him sideways. Do you have ideas? This old slave wouldn't dare, he cried, hitting his head on the ground. In the past, he would have been ecstatic. Vacant seats meant more positions to sell and more power to grab. But today he was terrified. He realized that 70% of the officials left in the room were his men. And if I could wipe out the other half of the court in an afternoon, he knew exactly who was next on my list. Wei Zhongxian wasn't an idiot. He knew that if he tried to grab all those empty seats for his own people, he'd be signing his death warrant. No emperor would tolerate a servant having that much control. He was a snake, but he was a smart one. I nodded, feeling satisfied. My constant pressure over the last few days was working. The old dog still had some use in him. I told him to fill the positions with temporary staff from the existing departments for now. Next spring, I'm holding a special imperial exam, I announced. That's when we'll choose the permanent replacements. Wei bowed low. I waited a moment, but the rest of the officials were silent. They looked like they were afraid to even breathe. I waved my hand dismissively and told them we were done for the day. Then, I turned and walked out of the gate of supreme harmony. I didn't need to look back to know they were all bowing. The moment I disappeared from sight, the entire square let out a collective breath of relief. I could almost hear their frantic whispers. They were convinced the spirit of the great ancestor, Hongwu, had possessed me. My eyes, my voice, my ruthlessness, I wasn't the boy they used to know. My cover story was working perfectly. Down in the square, Shi Fenglai hurried over to Wei Zhongxian. He started to say something, but Wei didn't let him finish. He spun around and delivered a massive slap to the man's face. From now on, if anyone calls me Lord of 1,000 Years again, I'll tear your mouth off. Wei hissed, his eyes wild with fear. And stop building those shrines in my name. Look at what happened to Cui Qingxiu. If you want to live, do your jobs. If you screw up, don't come crying to me. Just go find a quiet spot and dig your own grave. He stormed off, leaving the officials staring at each other in total shock. The world they knew was gone. The Ming dynasty was changing. I made my way back to the palace of heavenly purity. It didn't take long for Wei Zhongxian to follow. He rushed into the hall and threw himself onto the floor in front of my desk. This old slave is guilty, he cried. Please, Your Majesty, punish me. I didn't even look up from my scrolls. And what exactly is your crime? I asked casually. I was blind, he sobbed, banging his head against the floor. I let a piece of trash like Cui Qingxiu into your court. I have failed your grace. He hit the floor 3 more times and stayed there, face down and trembling. He was terrified. Even though I had protected him during the meeting, he couldn't read me anymore. He didn't know if he was next. I closed the scroll and stood up. I walked over and crouched down right next to him. Wei, I said softly, do you know what a shit-stirring stick is?